Okay, I've got 7 o'clock. We'll get started here.
I got 30 seconds.
Okay, we'll give George his 30 seconds. It wasn't quite 30 seconds, George. Just a couple of reminders. Remember the Nevins grandbaby's going to have surgery in a couple of weeks, hopefully, if everything pans out all right. We've got several who have recovered from surgery. Nikki Bettis Ross is having her treatments. She due for another treatment soon? Oh, there you are. No more. All clear. Okay. Now if you can just do something about that guy sitting next to you, right? Sorry, I couldn't pass it up. All right, well, that's great news. As we continue in Daniel, remember I'll be watching the YouTube channel here, looking for questions or comments that come through on that. And remember, one of the things we're encouraging ourselves to do is pray like Daniel, and we'll especially see that next week in chapter 9. But as we go through, think about Daniel and the kind of person he is. Last week, we didn't quite finish, and so I'm going to cover just a couple of things on that before I start on tonight's handout in chapter 8. We got to the times, and halftime in verse 25 of chapter 7. That term is used a couple of different ways in the Bible. It's used in Revelation 12:14. And most people think that it has to do with a rather specific time, about 3.5 years. And there's a calculation, they feel like a time is a year, and then times is 2 years, and then a half time. But I don't want to go into a lot of detail on that. There is a specific amount of time that God is going to allow certain things to happen, is the gist of that I want you to get. The time that sacrifice was stopped in the temple, and we'll talk about that, was about 3.5 years. In Revelation, it uses the term time times halftime, and it uses 42 months, and one place in 13:5 in Revelation. In Revelation 12:6, it says 1,260 days, which translates out to about 3.5 years. In another place, it says 42 months. Which translates out to 3.5 years. So this 3.5 year thing means something. We may not, while we're here in this physical body, may not know the exact detail, meaning, and purpose of that, but I think it really has to do with periods of persecution of the church or God's people, and we'll talk a little bit more about that tonight. Last week we talked about the four kingdoms a little bit, and spent more time on the fourth kingdom, which we talked about being the Roman Empire, the fourth beast. And during the period of the fourth beast, there was a persecution of the church. Church had been established then. But one of the things I think it's important to remember, even during times of persecution, God's people can flourish spiritually. The church was established under the Roman rule. The church spread under Roman rule. There were times when they weren't as persecuted as much, and there were times they were persecuted more, but the church grew and prospered spiritually under Roman rule, and sometimes under Roman persecution under people like Nero, and they executed several of the prophets. The Roman Empire, as was pointed out in chapter 7, was punished and is destroyed. And the Roman Empire, as we know it historically, does not exist anymore. The theme from 7, and we'll continue into chapter 8 tonight, is God's kingdom will always exist under His providential care. God will find a way for the kingdom to survive, and we'll see that. And that's, I think, one of the messages of Daniel, to say that God knows how He's going to deal with certain things before they even happen. And we'll see some of that. We'll see that last week with the Roman Empire. He said it was going to go for a little while, and then it was going to be punished. And it was destroyed. And we'll see that again tonight. So chapter 8. Last week Daniel was astounded a little bit or alarmed. It is completely normal as we go through these visions and prophecies of Daniel to not get it all, to look at it and go, I am bumfuzzled. Daniel didn't get it. He didn't get it all. If you look at chapter 7, verse 15, he says, my spirit was distressed, and the visions of my mind kept alarming me. In Daniel 7:28, he said, my thoughts were greatly alarming me, and my face grew pale at the things that he saw and heard. Tonight, we're going to see in verse 27 of chapter 8, he will say, I was exhausted and sick for days over the things he had seen. He said, I was astounded. And he said, there was none to explain it. So if we feel overwhelmed by these, we're in good company. If Daniel was overwhelmed, we shouldn't feel bad about being overwhelmed by those. And Daniel, as we're going to see tonight, even had someone sent to him to explain it. And he still was astounded and confused and upset, alarmed, exhausted in the things that he was. So as we go through these prophecies, we're going to see how the kingdom of God is in constant war with worldly nations and with Satan, and that the kingdom will survive. And then God will deal with those who persecute and punish and mistreat the righteous in the kingdom. And final victory is going to be assured. Orrin mentioned in his class Sunday afternoon, I think it was the last slide or next to the last slide, said he's going to be talking about in the next few weeks, and I wrote this down. He says we're going to be talking about God's hand in the affairs of men, including his orchestrating the rise and the fall of nations. And we're seeing that in Daniel. God is orchestrating the rise and fall. Nebuchadnezzar was brought to punish the children of Israel because they were unfaithful. Jeremiah foretold and said, you're going to be to Israel, you're going to be in exile for 70 years. After that, I'm going to punish this nation of Babylon. And he did. We saw that in Daniel chapter 5. The last king was executed and the nation fell. So we will see that, and we're going to see more examples of that. We're also seeing that how God reconciles all things. And the key to this, he doesn't reconcile things when I want him to reconcile things. There's some things I would like for him to reconcile right now. But God doesn't work on my calendar or Bill's calendar or Ernest's calendar. He works on his calendar. And he does things when he knows they need to be done. And they're not done all at once. I mean, each of us could probably write down a list of people we think God needs to just take out. I mean, if we're honest with ourselves, there's a list of people we think the world would be better without. Probably some of us would have the same names on their list. It's not my decision. It's God's decision about those things and what purpose they may or may not be solving for him at that particular time. There were a lot of people upset with Nebuchadnezzar, but he was God's servant, Isaiah said, to do what God wanted him to do, which was to punish Israel, and he did. And then he was punished for his treatments and his things that he did. So last week we saw a lot of information about the fourth terrifying beast. This week we're going to see a lot about the second and third beasts. And we are going to be introduced to an angel by name for the first time in the Bible, Gabriel. And so we'll talk about him a little bit later. And we'll be given specific names of these second and third kingdoms, or these second and third beasts that will be given information. So let's start with the first 4 verses of chapter 8. Third year of the reign of Belshazzar, the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, and this was subsequent to the one he had seen 2 years ago. If you look back at chapter 7, verse 1, I looked, and while I was there, while I was looking in the vision in Susa, and he said, I saw in verse 3 a ram with 2 horns, standing by the canal. 2 horns were long, one was longer, and the other than the other, and the longer one coming up last. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power. He did as he pleased. 2 years later, he sees this vision, and it begins. Briefly, there's two thoughts. He says in Susa, that's not the capital of Babylon. He could have been there on work on behalf of the king, or that's where he could have been in his vision. Ezekiel, for example, was carried to Jerusalem in one of his visions. John was carried away to the wilderness in one of his visions. So we don't know, and it really doesn't matter. Remember, Susa is where the Persian kingdom was based when they came along. That's where we were introduced to Queen Esther. So he sees this ram with 2 horns going in 3 directions. As you go through, I want to point these things out, and you can say, well, that's just a coincidence, or maybe not. The second beast in chapter 7 was a bear with how many ribs? 3. How many directions is this ram going? 3. What do y'all think? Does he think that, I think it does. I think there's something there. Can't tell you exactly what it is, but I think it's something there, some consistency. There were 3 major kingdoms that the Persians captured, one of them being Babylon. That may have something to do with it. And it said the ram had 2 horns. One was more prominent. In the beginning of the Medes and the Persians, the Medes were kind of the leaders, more powerful in the group. Later, the Persians became much superior, and they were the leaders, and it really was a Persian kingdom. And what was the bear doing in chapter 7? He's leaning to one side. Coincidence? Not coincidence? I don't know. There are these patterns, though, that you see through the Bible in these prophecies, and I think that the Lord is trying to get across to us some things that we may not understand. In this particular case, I think he's showing the difference between the Medes and the Persians in the United Kingdom that they had. But anyway, some people even get more specific and say this is Cyrus the Great. I would not go there. So the vision continues in verses 5 through 8. There was a male goat. It came from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and had a great conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had 2 horns and struck him in verse 7 and shattered his 2 horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. He hurled him to the ground, trampled him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. And the male goat magnified himself exceedingly. But as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in his place there came up 4 conspicuous horns towards the 4 winds of the heaven. Which direction did Alexander the Great come from? The west. Came from the west. One of the few nations to expand from the west to the east, but they did. Rome was another one expanded in that way. But anyway, so what does it mean that it says his feet didn't touch the ground? What does that tell you? He's moving fast. He's moving so fast his feet aren't even touching. How long did it take Alexander to conquer everything that he conquered? Less than 10 years. I mean, a huge empire in less than 10 years. He conquered most of the Persian Empire in less than 3 years. Nobody could stop him but himself. So, he had other traits that were, he was ferocious and mighty and enraged. And so, what happened to his kingdom after he died? Well, what happened to him? How did he die? Most people think he drank himself to death, lamenting that he had no more worlds to conquer. Don't know, that's a historical fact that may or may not be true. The Bible doesn't say that about him, but it says that he, after these few years, he was dead. His kingdom was divided how? at his death. Pardon? 4 ways. We got 4 horns coming up. I really, it helps me to think about the patterns as I go through these prophecies and how they match up with history as we know it. So anyway, these 4 kingdoms were the Greeks, the area of Asia Minor, the Syrians, and Egypt. The Syrians and the Egyptians are going to be really the only ones we care about biblically, because they fought continually over the land of Palestine, with eventually the Syrian kingdom gaining control over Palestine and winning out. So this vision is going on, and so the vision continues in chapter 8, verse 9 through 14. Out of one of them, out of one of those 4 horns, came forth a rather small horn. It grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, towards the beautiful land. It grew up to the host of heaven, caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth. It trampled them down. It magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him. The place of his sanctuary was thrown down, and on the account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice. Fling truth to the ground, and it will perform, and it will prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking. Another holy one said to the particular one who was speaking, How long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply, and the transgression to cause horror, as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? And he said, 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the holy place will be properly restored. We're going to spend a little bit more time here. There's a long and torturous explanation in the Truth for Today commentary. If you really want to read a whole lot, you can go there and do that. And explains historically, but we understand that this 4th horn came up out of this Syrian kingdom, and some of the things that Antiochus Epiphanes did really match and go along with these things, that he magnified himself to be equal with commander of the host, removed regular sacrifice, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And all of these things happened for a period of 2,300 evenings and days. Here are some of the things that Antiochus Epiphanes did. He constructed a Greek arena to have Greek games. If you know the Greeks, their games were performed in the nude. And so he had that, and that would be certainly an abomination. Circumcision was forbidden. In fact, if you, as a mother, had your child circumcised and he caught you, the child would be executed. He'd be put on a chain and dangled around your neck. Those are the kind of things that this man did, and you can see he was at war with the Jews. He wanted the Jews to be Greek. He wanted that to be their language, their religion. He destroyed copies of the law. One historical account says that every month he sent the troops out to search for copies of the law, and if he found any, he tore those up and found them in your house. Then you were killed and your house was burned down. All these atrocities went on. He removed the high priest and put someone else in his place, because that guy said, I can get more money for you. And so he said, I like that, and he put that guy in as the high priest. He erected an altar to Zeus on top of the altar of burnt offering, and then sacrificed. What would you think would be the worst thing that he could sacrifice on God's altar? Pig. And that's exactly what he did. Sacrificed a pig, and then took the blood from that pig and sprinkled it everywhere he could find all over the temple. And what did that do to the temple? Desecrated it, made it unclean. And so he did all these things. Estimates are that about 100,000 Jews were murdered because they refused to comply with what he was doing. I don't know what percentage of the population that was, but that's a significant number. It was missed. So, who's heard of the Maccabean revolt? This, right after this, the Jews rise up. And when you just think about people, if you oppress people enough, they will rebel some way or another. Nobody has been able to completely repress and oppress a people without getting a reaction. They will revolt somehow. There's something. But the Maccabees revolted, and they actually won. They threw them out, and they regained control. But I really believe, I agree with, and really, the Truth for Today, Rex Turner, and Burton Kaufman all agree that this is the guy. This is the little horn. This 2,300 days that he mentions here, how long it's going to last. The most reasonable, to me, the most reasonable explanation is that is the period that this guy was in charge and that he stopped the temple worship. Rex Turner in his commentary takes that and he says, okay, a morning and an evening are one day, so you divide that by 2, you get 1,150 days, and that works out to 3.5 years, about. So you go back to the time, times, half times, the 42 months, and all of those consistencies across the Bible, and you get this term. So, but it can go way out there. One guy calculated out that was 2,300 years, and that fell during the Six-Day War in 1967. When what happened? What did Israel do in 1967? One at a time. That's the Six-Day War. What happened? What did they capture? Jerusalem. That's his calculations. I don't buy it. I don't think. And why would that not be correct? What is where the temple is now? What's there? Wait a minute, I didn't say that. What's there now where the temple once stood? The Dome of the Rock, which is, both of y'all said, the Muslim. So the temple hadn't been restored, wasn't restored in 1967. The Dome of the Rock is still there. I can't imagine what would happen if Israel was to tear that thing down. It'd be much worse than what's going on with the Ukrainians and the Russians, I believe. But anyway, so as we think about those things as they go on, Daniel saw the vision in verse 13. He said, I sought to understand. Behold, there was standing before me one who looked like a man. I heard a voice of a man between the banks, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. So he came near to me where I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened at him. Anybody who was faced with God directly was frightened in the Bible. Every time someone was faced with an angel or a being of God was fearful. And he fell on his face because of the seeing Gabriel. He said, I was frightened, I fell on my face, and he said to me, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. While he was talking to me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. He touched me and made me stand upright. He said, Behold, I'm going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. Then he tells him, the ram that you saw with the 2 horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. So we are told right then who he is. So when we put these things together, so you go back and you look all the way back to chapter 2, and there was the great statue, and so the second kingdom was what? Silver. And then in chapter 7, we had another of the bear, and now we're told here this second one is the Medes and the Persians. So you can kind of tie these together and get some consistency and see. So he tells him. Now we're going to talk about Gabriel a little bit. What all did Gabriel do in the Bible that we know about? He appeared 2 times to Daniel and talked to Daniel. He did 2 other things. He's the one that came to Mary, said, hey, I have some news for you. Who else did he talk to? One other person, Zacharias, and said, you're going to have a son. What happened to Zacharias?
He couldn't talk for a while.
Well, he didn't believe. He said, what do you mean? What did Gabriel say? Where did Gabriel say he stood? Where did Gabriel say he stood? In the presence of God. Therefore, you're not going to talk. Still later. When did Zacharias speak? After they named the child. He wrote it out when they were going to circumcise John. So that's Gabriel. He's named there those 4 times. This time of the end that's mentioned in 17 and 19, I really believe that it's important to stay within the context of this vision. And the context of this vision is what? I mean, I've gone through it real quick, but what has happened in this vision? What has happened to the temple and God's people? They've been destroyed. They've been desecrated.
Are you talking about AD 70?
No.
Oh, you're talking about
Before that. The temple has been desecrated. The people have been tortured. The people have all this has happened to them. He's tried to eliminate sacrifices. This is why I believe that he's talking about what's going on here, and that there's going to be an end to this, because he did say to him, how long was it going to last? 2,300 mornings and evenings. So we have a time, and I believe that's to be consistent with what's going on, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So Gabriel then continues to explain. In verse 21, he says, the goat represents the kingdom of Greece. So now we know that's the 3rd kingdom from that statue in chapter 2 and the 3rd beast in chapter 7. It says the large horn that is between his eyes is the 1st king. The broken horn and the 4 horns that rose in its place represent 4 kingdoms which will arise from his nation, though not with his power. So as we talk about those things, so you go historically and you can see, who all took Western Civ? I took Western Civ. Everybody enjoyed it thoroughly, right? Yeah. Well, a lot of this is not Western Civ. There was another course that I took, Ancient Civilization, and it was, yeah, I stayed awake for the whole class. Did you, Chris? Did you stay awake?
I got a question.
Yes, Ernest.
It said 4 kingdoms which will arise from his nation.
Mm-hmm.
Who's he talking about there? Who in Greece is he talking about?
After, well, I kind of alluded to that a minute ago, but I was going fast. After Alexander died, 4 of his generals divided his kingdom up and took over. And the angel Gabriel is going to explain some of this here. We know that this kingdom is Greece, and that's the large horn, and it will be broken. And there were 4 horns that took its place. I think I went too fast on one particular thing. No, I didn't. Okay. Thought I'd lost myself there. So in verse 21, he identifies the horn. Then he says in verse 23, in the latter period of their rule, a king will arise. That's that small horn. His power will be mighty, but not by his own power. He will destroy to an extraordinary degree and will prosper and perform his will. He will destroy mighty men and holy people. And that's what we just talked about, Antiochus Epiphanes, the things that he did, everything that he destroyed and the people that he destroyed, and the 100,000 Jews that he was responsible for his death. Through his shrewdness, he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence. He will magnify himself in his heart. One of the things that Antiochus Epiphanes did was he named himself God Manifest. Pretty cocky. And he named himself Illustrious. illustrious. Pretty impressive.
Get you in trouble.
Those kind of things God notices. The Jews named him Antiochus Madman, which probably fit. You know, I was thinking when I was going through this, I was thinking about our class Sunday morning in Mike Penrod's class. We talked about the wolves in sheep's clothing, how they disguise themselves to fool the people with intent. This guy never put on sheep's clothing. He just blatantly came out and said, I'm God, and I'm taking over, and this is what you're going to do, and you're going to worship Zeus, and you're going to do all these things, or else. And he didn't mind doing the or else. All right, so he goes through, he will magnify himself in verse 25, but he will be broken without human agency. Historically, Antiochus Epiphanes just died. He died.
Does that mean that without human agency, does that mean God performed it?
Well, that's for you to decide, Ernest. He was at war, but he had a problem. He didn't have no money. Soldiers don't like to fight without getting paid. And so he decided he was going to rob the temple, but he got outsmarted and he wasn't able to do it. And so he died. Burton Kaufman quotes some historians that say that they believed he died of his own madness because he wasn't getting his way. I don't know, but he did not die in battle. That's all I'm pretty sure of. So when he says he was broken without human agency, he died. That's all I can tell you. He died. So the visions of the evenings and the mornings which have been told is true, but keep the vision secret, for it pertains to many days in the future. Then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days, and I got up again and carried on the king's business, but I was astounded at the vision, and there was none to explain. All right, Daniel's exhausted, he's alarmed and everything. So do you believe that Daniel understood each and everything these visions was talking about? He's still, even though Gabriel was there explaining to him, he still didn't. Are you wanting to make a comment? Make a comment, come on.
Gabriel tells him, don't go talking about this stuff. So, twofold reason for that. Daniel doesn't understand the vision fully. He's out there proclaiming the vision. We're told by Paul to sit down and shut up. You're, about to prophesy or speak in tongues and nobody's able to interpret for you. So if you're out there, Daniel's out there saying things that he has no clue what the actual outcome is. It does the people of God no good. And that's why Gabriel says these things are further out in the future. You go tell them to other people, like they're going to think it's supposed to be now, and these people won't even see the outcome of
No.
that you're talking about.
For the people who are listening online, I'm going to try to summarize what you just said. One of the reasons that he might have been told to not say anything, to seal it up, was if he did say something, well, people might think he's cuckoo, for one thing, and they wouldn't understand, probably, and he was having trouble understanding. So, anyway, Chad, have you got?
So, why did he write it down?
Good point. Now, here's a thought for you guys. If you look at the New International, I wrote this down, the New King James and the English Standard, they use the terminology seal up the vision, which means maybe preserve it, write it down, which he did write it down. But still, where I am, I agree with you, Chris. I'm sure if he went out and said much, people are going to say, well, he's getting up there in years, he's probably in his 80s. Yeah, I'm sure maybe he had a little nightmare, bad gas, ate some bad fish, whatever. But at some point, what good does prophecy do if it's not shared? Okay, you got your hand and then George, so go, Chris.
Well, we have the luxury of seeing, like for us specifically, Christians in the 20th century, we have the luxury of being able to look back at the prophecies and see their outcomes and go, yes, Daniel was told this was supposed to be Greece, and we all learned that in ancient Western Civ.
Right.
Like we know these, we can look
Now we know this.
we can look at the historical narrative that's being taught out there in the secular world and go, yes, this matches exactly what Daniel prophesied. Therefore, we know his prophecy to be true, and we can trust it. And because we can trust it, we have more faith in God.
Right. Okay. They didn't have that. They didn't have the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. Okay, George.
Well, and the thing about prophecies, if it's going to take place in the future, you're going to have people that are going to sit there and try and match everything along the line. It's going to be this. Oh no, that's right. Then it's going back like this.
Yeah.
Because look at when Peter's talking the prophecy of Joel. This is right now. Well, how far back did he make that prophecy? Way back when Joel was over 400 years before that.
Well, what did people think Jesus was here to do? A kingdom. They were ready. Even up to the very end, his own disciples said, "Are you going to restore the kingdom now?" Even up to that point. Well, yes, he was going to make a kingdom, just not the kingdom that they thought. So yeah, they would struggle, but there has to be something for the people that are there. And it may be write it down, keep it, because about 400 years later is when all this stuff's going to happen. And part of it is, it certainly builds my faith to see that, even back 150 years before Nebuchadnezzar, Isaiah was calling Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus out by name. And through hindsight, we got to see that. So at some point when all this is going on, people can say, wow, Daniel told us. We maybe not understood it. I don't understand everything in Revelation, do y'all? I don't. And be worried about the fellow that says he does.
Oh, I bet you Daniel said to God, "Come on, God, not me again."
Yeah, why are you doing this to me? Kaufman pointed out in his, on this last verse, he said, Daniel made no claim to understand everything that he was writing down and preserving. He didn't say, I understand it all, but he was writing it down and preserving it. I can certainly see when Isaiah is talking about Emmanuel and the Messiah that did he understand all of what he was saying? No, he did not. He did not. Some of this, I believe, goes back to proving and helping us understand God's providence. And I've mentioned this a couple of times. I want you to think about a few things. So the Persians, they came bursting onto the scene, and they tried their best to conquer Greece. One historian says they even had a 1,000,000-man army marching west, and they were going to take on the Greeks and the Macedonians. They had to outnumber those guys 10-1. And we've all probably seen the movie about the 300 Spartans. And we've seen those things, and we've studied those things. There is no way on paper that they should not have just rolled through Greece unopposed. They should have rolled through there and left nothing in their wake. But they didn't. Why not? I don't know. But they should have on paper. That's where I come to. I think about these things. So the second time they went up there, and they got embarrassed. They lost their navy, and their army was massacred by the Greeks and the Spartans and the Macedonians. That's when Ahasuerus went back, said, I shouldn't have deposed Vashti. And who did he put in as queen? Esther. How important was Esther?
Big. She saved the Israelites.
Yes, she kept them from being massacred. So did God providentially stop Ahasuerus from conquering the Greeks and being embarrassed and going back? Your answer is as good as mine. But you start looking at these things across time, these things that happen, and you go, how did that happen? There are people who theorize that Alexander the Great did one wonderful thing, which was language. He brought a universal language across that entire part of the world, the Greek language, which really helped the church in its infancy to be able to communicate and preach the gospel across all peoples, many, many peoples across the world. I don't know. Our study in this time really, I think, should help us see that God has a plan. He will reconcile things. He's just going to do it on His schedule. Now, I want to finish out the class a little bit talking about God's vengeance and this reconciliation, because I don't know about you, but it bugs me that people get away with it, that nations get away with it. It's ugly what goes on in the world. But God does not let things go on forever. He does make people pay. You know, He said, I'm going to punish Israel. And then He told Jeremiah, He says, after that 70 years are complete in Jeremiah 25:12, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation. And He did in Daniel chapter 5. They walked right in on the riverbank under the wall and took the city and killed Belshazzar. Here in this chapter, the small horn said he will be, in verse 25, he will be broken without human agency, and he was destroyed. The little horn in the fourth kingdom in Daniel chapter 5, he says, but the court will sit for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away, annihilated, and destroyed forever. But he did a lot of bad things before that happened. Antiochus Epiphanes did a lot of bad things before he was judged. So it came to me to think of Romans 12, where Paul said, vengeance is mine. I will repay. And he's quoting Deuteronomy 32. Vengeance is mine and retribution. In due time, their foot will slip. In due time. Not my time, but in due time. Going on, Paul says, leave room for the wrath of God. What does God want us to do? Does He want us to concentrate on vengeance, or does He want us to concentrate on spreading the gospel?
Spread the gospel.
The gospel.
Trusting Him.
Yes. And the church has grown under periods of extreme persecution. But God is telling His people, He told the Israelites, and Paul told us, leave room for the wrath of God. He's going to deal with that. I'll be on my soapbox for just this little bit. We need to be worried. My sister used to tell, Judy, my sister used to tell me to worry about my cell phone when we were little at home. Mind my own business. And that's what we need to do, is mind our own business and worry about the gospel and let God take care of the world, and us preach the gospel, because the gospel is the cure for the world. And I think that's one of the messages out of Daniel. Next week, we're going to see one of the greatest prayers in the Bible, Daniel chapter 9. Spend some time on Daniel chapter 9. His prayer is magnificent. And there is so much in that prayer that Daniel gave. He knows when he's praying that prayer, he knows the 70 years is about up. And he knows, and he even mentions that he's read the book. He said, I read the book. I saw the 70 years is almost up. I can count. And so he pleads before God and confesses his sins and the people's sins. So read that, and it's to me one of the greatest prayers in the Bible. So I appreciate the comments that you all shared tonight. I think it's been a wonderful, these 2 chapters are wonderful to show God's providential care, I think. So, all righty, I'll cut you loose. Thanks.